Chapter 11. Persona. The word person has a curious history. It comes from the Etruscan fersu into the Latin persona, meaning a mask. It had reference in both cases to the mask worn by actors, thus to a pretended character, a dramatic figure rather than a reality. This use of persona pointed to a fact in classical antiquity, that is, the insubstantial nature of man. Men were defined socially, by nation and by class. The view of classical antiquity with respect to people was, in a sense, closer to Karl Marx than to the Bible. Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans gives us examples of this, taken from the highest levels of society. Thus we are told of Lycurgus of Sparta, quote, Lycurgus allowed a man who was advanced in years and had a young wife to recommend some virtuous and approved young man, that she might have a child by him, who might inherit the good qualities of the father and be a son to himself. On the other side, an honest man who had love for a married woman upon account of her modesty and the well-favouredness of her children might, without formality, beg her company of her husband, that he might raise, as it were, from this plot of good ground, worthy and well-allied children for himself. And indeed, Lycurgus was of a persuasion that children were not so much the property of their parents as of the whole commonwealth, and therefore would not have his citizens begot of the first-comers, but by the best men that could be found. The laws of other nations seemed to him very absurd and inconsistent, where people would be so solicitous for their dogs and horses as to exert interest and to pay money to procure fine breeding, and yet kept their wives shut up to be made mothers only by themselves, who might be foolish, infirm, or diseased, as if it were not apparent that children of a bad breed would prove their bad qualities first upon those who kept and were rearing them, and well-born children, in like manner, their good qualities. These regulations, founded on natural and social grounds, were certainly so far from that scandalous liberty which was afterward charged upon their women, that they knew not what adultery meant. End quote. Some might object to this and maintain that the Athenians were not given to the practices of Sparta. In answer to this, one need only examine Plato's Republic and its belief that the philosopher king should have access to all women. Turning to the Romans, Plutarch reported of Cato the Younger, quote, It is thus related by Thrasea, who refers to the authority of Munatius, Cato's friend and constant companion. Among many that loved and admired Cato, some were more remarkable and conspicuous than others. Of these was Quintus Hortensius, a man of high repute and approved virtue, who desired not only to live in friendship and familiarity with Cato, but also to unite his whole house and family with him by some sort of other alliance in marriage. Therefore he set himself to persuade Cato that his daughter Portia, who was already married to Bibulus and had borne him 2 children, might nevertheless be given to him as a fair plot of land to bear fruit also for him. For, said he, quote, Though this is the opinion of many men may seem strange, yet in nature it is honest and profitable for the public that a woman in the prime of her youth should not lie useless and lose the fruits of her womb, nor, on the other side, should burden and impoverish one man by bringing him too many children. Also, by this communication of families upon worthy men, virtue would increase and be diffused through their posterity, and the commonwealth would be united and cemented by their alliances. End quote. Yet if Bibulus would not part with his wife altogether, he would restore her as soon as he had bought him a child, whereby he might be united to both their families. Cato answered that he loved Hortensius very well, and much approved of uniting their houses, but he thought it strange to speak of marrying his daughter when she was already given to another. Then Hortensius, turning the discourse, did not hesitate to speak openly and ask for Cato's own wife, for she was young and fruitful, and he had already children enough. Nor can it be thought that Hortensius did this, as imagining Cato did not care for Marcia, for it is said, She was then with request, but said that Philippus, the father of Marcia, ought to be also consulted. Philippus, therefore, being sent for, came, and finding they were well agreed, gave his daughter Marcia to Hortensius in the presence of Cato, who himself also assisted at the marriage. This was done at a later time, but since I was speaking of women, I thought it well to mention it now. End quote. Such a step was not commonplace, but it was logical, given the presuppositions of the classical view of man. It was a view widely present in the pre-Christian world, apart from the Hebrews. In Henry Frankfurt's Before Philosophy, 1946, John A. Wilson and Thorkild Jacobson called attention to the fact that the cosmos was viewed in some cultures as a state, with both the gods and men sharing a continuity of being. The implication of this was that a stateless man was in effect a non-person. Man was defined by his place in this cosmic state. For biblical faith, however, man, having been created in the image of God, Genesis 1:26-28, is defined by that image, not by the cosmic state. That image of God in man is knowledge, righteousness or justice, holiness and dominion, Genesis 1:26-28, Colossians 3:10, Ephesians 4:24. For non-Christian man, the universe is one continuous being, with gradations of being, but no law from above. Cato the Younger, like Lycurgus's rules, decided the use of his wife in terms of humanistic ideas. Any Christian or Hebrew would have been governed by God's law. In either case, the concept of the person differs. For the Roman, a person, philosophically, is a mask a being wears at a particular point in time and space. For biblical faith, a person is a creature of God, created in his image and subject to his laws. For the modern humanist, a man can choose his lifestyle in terms of his preferences because no divine law can stand over him nor govern him. He sees himself as, philosophically, an evolutionary product, coming from below, and as a brief persona or mask worn by life and evolution. Because he wants freedom for his persona, he wants respect for the total environment, including rats, mice, and cockroaches. His environmental regulations protect them. They are manifestations of Gaia, Mother Earth. The early church took the word persona and defined it, not as a mask on an actor, but in terms of a hypostasis, from hypo under and histemi to stand. There is one nature, physis, one substance, ousia, to the Godhead, and three persons. One of the greatest intellectual revolutions in the history of thought had taken place. People were no longer seen as temporary masks of being. Persons now were creatures made in the communicable attributes of the triune God. A wife or daughter could no longer be legitimately disposed of at will. The law of God was now the source of government over all things. This was a revolution in thinking that set the Christians against the world. Previously, this reference of all things to a supernatural order had been the mark of a troublesome people whom the Romans disliked and found pestilential. Now the Christians far exceeded the Jews in their challenge to classical thought. The primary reference of persona was now to God, three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. On the created level, man alone possesses personhood or personality in a created and derivative sense, derived from God's creative act. In Hebrews 1:3, quote, the express image of his person, end quote, is in the Greek hypostasis, substance or person. Another Greek word to express the Latin persona was prosopon, used in 2 Corinthians 4:6. Quote, the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, end quote. Almost at once, the New Testament was using Greek words and by implication Latin to express biblical concepts. There were later disputes between the Greek and Latin churches as to which word, hypostasis or persona was more accurate. Because of this changed meaning, person could no longer mean a mask or an appearance, a temporary expression of things in a stream of life, but rather stood for an act of God, a creature with a calling from God and an eternal destiny, a life in heaven or hell. Being a person in the Christian sense thus meant a great responsibility and an accountability to God. The new meaning began in the eternal being of the triune God rather than in an accident of evolution, a Greek concept in origin. As Christianity grew, spread, and prevailed to some degree over Europe and then in various parts of the world, attempts at redefinition set in. Sadly, some of the redefinition occurred within the Church. For example, L.W. Geddes in the Catholic Encyclopedia defined personality in terms of the concept of the self without reference to God. Centuries earlier, the Church's position had been clearer. These psychological definitions, Catholic and Protestant, were definitions downward, a retreat from the biblical faith. Besides the many psychological definitions, there were others, political, sociological, and in the case of Karl Marx, economical. All these depersonalized man. Instead of regarding himself as one created in the image of God, man now saw himself in terms of a Darwinian biology, a Marxist economics, a Freudian psychology, and so on. In all cases, the result was a diminished and emasculated man. Man was being remade into an emotional and psychological eunuch. Both man and history were depersonalized. Karl Marx was important in this depersonalization. For him, economics was the determinative in the making of man. And man's remaking or regeneration would come by economics, by a revolution to create a communist world. As a consequence of this depersonalization of man, and as a result of seeing man as an economic rather than a religious creature, Marx was hateful and venomous in his attitude towards Judaism and Christianity. In various essays, he attacked Christianity. In the essay of A World Without Jews, he vented his savage hatred of Jews. Both Jews and Christians should abandon their religion and seek, as the ground of human unity, science. Marx wanted a state, quote, professing no religion except its own statehood, end quote. Because for Marx the definition of man did not come from God, his idea of society actually was closer to the ant-hill and the beehive. The end of alienation for him meant the end of personhood. Man would again be like the animals. Walt Whitman expressed this ideal very clearly, quote, I think I could turn and live with animals. They are so placid and self-contained. I stand and look at them long and long. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. No one is dissatisfied. Not one is demented with the mania of owning things. Not one kneels to another, nor to his kind that lived 1,000 of years ago. Not one is respectable or industrious over the whole earth. End quote. Whitman was a city man. He did not know wild animals. What he is obviously describing are cows, domestic animals cared for by man. And his longing is for the end of personhood. As men today move in terms of Marx and Whitman, what we see is not the realization of a dream world, but a reversion to paganism, to barbarism, and to new depths of savagery.